And we are live! Hooray! Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Lunch and Learn, the hybrid special. We are both here in Shul, and we are on Zoom as well. So please do come and join us in either location as we delve back into our Lunch and Learn series, taking a look for a couple of minutes, first of all, at the Parsha, and then moving on to Pirkei Avot. So this week's Parsha is Tetzaveh, which is, broadly speaking, the Parsha that deals with the uniform of the Kohanim and the uniform of the Kohen Gadol as well. When they were serving in the Mishkan, when they were serving in the Tabernacle, when they were serving in the Beit HaMikdash as well, they had particular items of clothing that they had to wear. So the regular Kohanim wore a uniform comprised of 4 items of clothing, and then there were an extra 4 items of clothing for the Kohen Gadol. So the regular Kohanim, so everyone wore like this turban situation and this tunic and some pants and trousers and like a sash belt situation. But for the Kohen Gadol, he had extra items as well. He had a golden plate that he wore on his head called a tzitz. He had the ephod, which is the apron, or is it the breastplate? I can never remember my word. The ephod, I'm sorry, is the apron. He had also a tunic of some kind called the me'il. Is that right? I can never remember. And then he had the choshen, which was the breastplate with the different stones on the front. So if you want to find out more about the Kohen Gadol's uniform, check out Parshat Tetzaveh. That's one chunk of the contents of the Parsha. And we also read about the installation process to be able to inaugurate them as the Kohanim. The original Kohanim were just Aharon and his family. Those were the original Kohanim, and then we read later about 2 of his sons who end up passing away on the first day of service. So there weren't that many Kohanim at the beginning, but he and his sons, 4 sons, are the people designated to be the people in charge of the different sacrifices and the different parts of the ritual activities that went on every day in the Mishkan. And then one of the other things that actually comes up in this week's parasha is the special. First of all, is the daily offering, the Tamid offering, which was brought every morning and every evening. And the final part is about the incense, about the ketoret, the special blend of 15 ingredients, which would have been ground up according to a very closely guarded recipe by the family of Avtinas. And there were these 15 different spices and herbs and whatever else, which would be finely ground up into a powder. That powder would be burnt every single day on a special altar for the incense offering. One of the fascinating things about these ingredients is that 14 of these ingredients smelt very pleasant and very lovely. One of them actually smelt really quite foul on its own, and yet you couldn't fulfill the mitzvah of this particular offering if you didn't have this 15th ingredient as well. Right? And it was a very closely guarded recipe. The Talmud teaches us that at one point they tried to, as with any good businessman or business person, they tried to find cheaper labor elsewhere. So they wanted to pay somebody less to be able to make the ketoret, but they found that nobody could replicate this ingredient. It's been handed down through this particular family. And actually, one of these kind of almost Dan Brown style conspiracies, we don't have access to the ingredients, to the recipe for this incense, But we do have a tradition that somewhere out there, the descendants of this family actually do. And one day, once we're privileged to have the temple again, there will be a team of Kohanim ready and waiting and trained to be able to recreate this this special recipe. It's actually quite interesting. There is a yeshiva. Not a lot of people know this. There's a Beit Midrash, a yeshiva next to the Western Wall, near to the Western Wall in the old city, I think it's called a Teret Kohanim. And the people that attend this particular academy of Torah study are all Kohanim. And part of their learning curriculum is actually learning the halachot of service in the Beit HaMikdash. So that when the time comes, we've actually got people who are trained up to be able to do the work. It's quite cool. Anyway, so one of the ideas behind these ingredients, behind this recipe, why you would have a foul-smelling ingredient in there, is because ultimately one of the symbolic virtues of the incense is about bringing all different kinds of Jews together. And so we see this message also with the lulav and etrog, where the different parts of the lulav and etrog represent different types of Jews, but you can't have the mitzvah without bringing them all together and holding them in a united way. And in a similar vein, one of the messages of this incense is that different people do different things at different times, but we can't be a nation unless we learn to unify and unless we learn to embrace and live side by side one another. And so you can have, it's not particularly a nice idea to compare someone who to compare somebody to a foul-smelling spice, but the idea is nonetheless that that bringing all different types of Jews together is ultimately what we're about. Am echad kelev echad, one nation, one heart, and that symbolism is carried through in the mitzvah of the Ketorah. It's interesting, by the way. It was a beautiful smelling mixture, right? Even though it has one ingredient in there which doesn't smell pleasant, it still smells beautiful once it's all together. So yeah, a small idea on Parshat Tetzaveh. Gary, do you have a question? Because I can see you looked poised.
It's just the same with perfume manufacturing. Because if you go to a perfume factory,
yeah,
there are scents that are appalling to smell on their own, but they're essential to putting together to make them smell.
Well, thank you. Have you ever been to a perfume factory?
No, I've been to the Procter & Gamble factory when I was at school, down on the Thames, and it could smell from outside and inside was horrendous.
Really?
Horrendous. And what's produced and comes out the other end is sweet smelling.
It's sweet smelling. It reminds me of an article that I once read where somebody went to a factory and they walked in and they could smell the most delicious burgers. Oh, amazing. And then they went to a different part of the factory, they could smell the most delicious smelling donuts. And then they went to somewhere else, they could smell the most delicious smelling chips. There was just one problem. There wasn't even a morsel of food in the whole complex because they were producing the smells of these foods, which then get pumped around different bakeries and different restaurants and things like that. A lot of the smells that you might associate with different places is actually manufactured and not actually the smell of the food that you'd be buying. So yeah, David, and then Joy.
I think it's just worth mentioning in the Sedra that, as you know, and everybody knows, that Moses' name is not mentioned within this Sedra, and it's worth thinking about and knowing what the significance of that is about.
Thank you, David. Was everyone on Zoom able to hear that?
Part of it, yeah. Well,
part of it. David was just. That's right. That's right. It's the only parsha from the moment that Moses is born, all the way back in Parshat Shmot. It's the only parsha in the whole Torah where his name is not mentioned. And we'll see in Parshat Ki Tisa, he stands up to the Almighty when after the sin of the golden calf, when God is ready to wipe out the Jewish nation, and Moses stands up and says, well, if you're gonna wipe them out, then you've got to delete me, you've got to erase me from your book. The first case of cancel culture. If you want to wipe out the Jews, then you've got to wipe me out as well. And of course, God relents and he doesn't wipe out the people. But he says, I think the Talmud teaches us that because of the power of a threat like this from someone as significant as Moses, so God had to accede to his request in some way. And so he is removed from one parsha in the Torah. It's actually quite interesting. I think the Vilna Gaon points out that there's a very clever reason why it's Parshat Tetzaveh that he is omitted from. The Hebrew words that Moses says is Mechenina Mesifracha. Erase me, please erase me from your book, Mesifracha. And the Vilna Gaon says you can actually read that as Misefer Kaf, from the 20th Sefer, from the 20th block in the Torah. And if you go through Bereshit Noach Lech Lecha Vayerech Hayisara Toldot Vayetze Vayishlach Vayeshev Miketz Vayigash Vayechi Shemot Va'era Bo B'Shalach Yitro Mishpatim Teruma 20th Tetzaveh. So the Vilna Gaon says, "Erase me from the 20th book" is none other than Parshat Tetzaveh. Any more significance than that, David will give a follow-on share next week. Next week, David will give a
argument that Moshe put forward that changed Hashem's mind was when he said, if you wipe the Jewish people out, what will the other nations say? You
That's
took them
right.
out of Egypt and you destroyed them. So,
but Martin, that's next week's. That's next week's. Cedra. So don't spoil it yet.
If you compare it to the Haggadah, in the Haggadah Moses' name is not mentioned, and the reason we're told that it's not mentioned in the Haggadah is because it's Hashem who brought us out of the land. It's all about what Hashem's doing. It's not Moses is doing in the Haggadah, so his name is not mentioned. In this week's Sedra, it's really about Aaron. It's about the high priest. It's not about Moses again at all. It's absolutely about the high priest addressing the Kohanim. And to focus on them and not take the focus away from them because it's their day, again, Moses' name is not mentioned.
Very interesting.
And the lesson we learn from that actually is that you shouldn't take away from somebody their importance by interrupting and getting involved when it's quite obvious that the moment is about them. And that's what we should respect. That's what I learned in that case.
Thank you. That's great. Joy, you had a question as well?
Oh, it wasn't a question. It's a bit, well, it's what we were talking about before about the spices, the not yes.
Incense.
Incense, thank you. I think it could also be analogous to having one maybe person with not such a nice person surrounded by 14 people who are nice, and they can, by their influence, change the nature of the bad person.
Beautiful idea. Because we've seen. Did anyone hear that on Zoom? Was everyone able to hear that? Joy was saying that there's a significance as well. That when you've got one person who's not as nice or not as good as the others, so the fact that you could have such good, nice neighbors around you can actually influence and change a person for the better, and that's something that we've seen reflected in Pirkei Avot as well when we've talked about the importance of surrounding yourself with good people, and the Talmud also has statements that talk about, woe to someone who's not a good person and woe to someone that gets influenced by them. So that's great. A very beautiful observation as well. All right. If no other comments or questions, then let's get ourselves moving with our topic for today. Where is it? Oh, come on. Oh, no. Where is it? I haven't done it yet. Sorry about this, guys. I haven't got us the text on Zoom yet. We are going to be doing chapter 6, Mishnah 4. So if you just give me one moment, I'll get it up on the screen. I completely forgot to load this up. 5, 6, 7, says Martin. Says Martin, 5, 6, 7. Let's try this one again. There we go. Everyone able to see that? Wonderful. And everyone's able to see me, and we can get everyone going. All right, so here we go. Chapter 6, Mishnah 4, ladies and gentlemen. I'm hoping everyone is able to see this. It's coming through on Zoom, it looks like. So here we go. Who would like to read this Mishnah for everyone? Nice and loudly, please. Nice and loudly, Howard.
Okay. This is the way of Torah. Eat bread with salt, drink water by measure, sleep on the ground, live a life of hardship, but toil in the Torah. If you do so, you will be happy and it will be well with you. You will be happy in this world and it shall be well with you in the world to come.
Thank you very much indeed. Kach hi darka shel Torah. This is the way of Torah. So let's have a moment for this to sink in and let everyone come in with their comments and questions.
Why do we eat bread with salt?
Why do we eat bread with salt? You mean generally?
Yeah.
You mean generally? Oh.
Well, in this context, eat bread with salt.
In this context, okay, well, we'll get there. I mean, the superficial reading of this for me is quite stark. This is the way of Torah. You shall eat bread with salt. You shall ration the water that you drink. You shall drink. You shall sleep on the floor. I don't know what does the Siddur version there say. You shall. You shall. You shall.
Yeah. This is the way we live.
It says you
lead
will.
our lives.
You will.
Yeah.
You will. So it's easy to read this and think, what on earth? That's certainly my first reaction. But Peter says, why are we eating bread with salt? I mean, it looks like when we read this superficially that we're glorifying poverty. We're saying that, like, this is the way of Torah. This is what the Torah expects of us, to lead a very scaled back, frugal existence. And yet, we've probably sat here dozens of times and talked about how much it's within the permissibility of halakha to eat other food and to engage with the world and to sleep in a comfortable bed and to even have a beautiful home. So I would be surprised if this isn't confusing us in some way. Rita?
I think eat bread with salt. Bread is tasty, nice, it's something we need, and salt is bitter. So in life, not everything goes the way it should be. You get good moments and bad moments.
Oh, that's interesting. I
don't know. Salt is not. It's on its own. It's not really nice, is it? It's only nice when you mix with pepper and.
Oh gosh, I wish you'd have told me this with enough time for me to look at this again.
I don't know.
But there's something I wish I could find. I wish I could look up a whole bunch of allegorical commentaries on this now, because there's you just twigged something in my mind there, Rita, which I wonder if I could ever get to.
Salt is.
Salt is salty. It's not particularly pleasant on its own. So I'll tell you what you've just twigged in me over here, Rita. Okay, so when we look at this, it's the simplest way or the instinctive reaction is like, this is ridiculous. We can't be expected to sleep on the floor. That's not an existence. How is that relatable? How is that practicable? Okay, maybe in those days, but in terms of like an overarching theme, what does emerge is just a recognition that it's referring to the concept of things which demand sacrifice. right? So it's not a halachic guide. This is not a halacha that you can only eat bread with salt, but it's drawing out a nugget of wisdom that if one wants to I guess stand a chance of achieving with their Torah study, and really you could apply it then to anything in life, there has to be a degree of sacrifice that that person is willing to make, even if it took such drastic turns. I'll go into it in a minute, but it's not an excuse for us to turn around and say, sorry, I was too poor to be able to study, or I was too rich, I was too busy, I was too successful to be able to study, right? I'll come to it in a minute, the precedent that we have for people who said that, and they will say, well, we've got examples of people that actually did succeed. But you're bringing out something completely different, and I love it, because you're saying kachi darka shel Torah, the derech of Torah, the life journey that you might end up on, right? What would that look like? What could that look like for a Jewish life, a Jewish worldview, right? And you're saying pat b'melach tochal, that you shall eat bread, but you should have the bread with salt. And you're saying that bread is very sweet. The more you chew on it, the sweeter it becomes. Salt by nature is different to that. And maybe there's really deep references, and I'd need to think about it. And I love it, right? The way of Torah is, pat, let's say pat, when we talk about bread, it talks about livelihood. It talks about our journey through the commercial world, right? So you should have pat, you should have bread, you should have a livelihood. You should be able to engage in whatever you engage with in the world. But then maybe you're right. Maybe there's something about salt that's telling us the way of the world is that you should have this, but you're going to also encounter whatever salt represents. And I can't think off the top of my head what it represents. It's amazing. So
it can come the other way, because in that day and age, salt was a very expensive commodity. And
right?
it's much more luxurious than bread, much more expensive than bread. And it can be taken whichever way you want. But Friday night, we don't eat challah without salt on. We put, and that's a lovely thing to do.
Well, that's amazing as well.
Yeah, I think you can read this either way you want.
So
salt was certainly a luxury in those days.
That never dawned on me, but that's incredible as well, because then it's almost like saying you're going to have bread, everyone's going to have bread, but the way of Torah is to what? So we're saying it's actually to indulge,
to add to the bland taste of
that's
bread,
interesting.
ordinary bread, with a very expensive commodity.
That's very interesting. I've spent years looking at this and thinking, we're just trying to encourage a very primitive style of life, but you're actually saying the opposite. You're saying that for a Mishnah thousands of years ago to write that the way of Torah, the appropriate way to do this, is to actually indulge as well. That blows my mind.
Another question.
We'll go Rita, Morris, and then David.
Another question, very quickly. Is it only in Pirkei Avot that they tell you to eat bread with salt? Or is it in the Torah somewhere?
Okay, so that's from a halachic point of view, it does get discussed elsewhere. We have a section of Jewish law devoted to how to have a meal. So it does appear over there, right? We're used to having salt with bread on Shabbat. Actually, there is an idea, and I think it's practiced quite regularly amongst Sephardi people especially, but they will still dip their bread into salt anytime that they have a meal. And
also the salt is also added for making something more kosher as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say
with
kosher,
meat.
Kosher,
with meat, you do.
We have egg.
Although I don't know, you want to use that salt for your bread. I think it's
I don't know.
isn't koshering salt a lot more salty, potent? I don't know. But with regards to the regular practice of dipping it in, it's rooted ultimately in sacrifices in the temple. that every sacrifice would be accompanied by salt. We no longer have a temple, so our tables are likened to a sacrificial altar, and so it's part of the reason. Nothing to do with meat. Nothing to do with meat. Nothing. I'm talking about bread. Talking about bread. So there is a close link between the sacrifices in the temple, the fact that we don't have a temple, and our homes, of course, are modelled on the temple. So our tables are compared to the altar, in which case the food that we eat is compared to the sacrifices. And so that's why there's still a trace element of that carried through into eating our bread with salt. This is not necessarily a halacha. This is not Jewish law that the Pirkei Avot is trying to teach us.
This is just teaching us.
This is about our mindset. This is about our ethics, our values, our approach to a Torah guided life. There is no halacha except for Tisha B'Av, except for the 9th of Av. There's no halacha that you should sleep on a floor-like surface. You're allowed to sleep in a bed, right? So that's important. They very well may have done, yeah. And hay and
only the rich could afford
right.
type of bed.
But we're going to come back to what I thought, what generally the way that we look at this Mishnah. But let's go first to Morris, and then
also about spending time on the Torah as opposed to spending time on
other things,
working on material things.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that. But Morris was going to.
Just a thought. You were saying about bread being basic. Well, a stain is a piece of salt of the earth. So that's very basic. You know, the earth, and then you've got to toil, you've got to work hard. You know, learning the Torah. So that's basic. But although the Torah has been written, and as you well know, and everyone knows here, there's different levels that you can read into the Torah, the very basic level, and then you can go deeper and get more meanings and that. So you've got to toil.
Interesting. Just a thought. I like it. I like it a lot. And we'll tie it all into just the kind of superficial explanation in a minute. David.
Maybe he's saying something slightly different. Maybe he's saying that even if you have to eat just bread with salt, and even if you just you don't have a bed, and even if you live a life of hardship, it doesn't matter. If you study Torah, then you'll be a happy person.
Yes.
Maybe that's the balance of what he's saying.
So that's where I was heading.
Oh, sorry.
In line with that, in line with what you're saying, what Morris is saying, and what Howard's saying, that's kind of how I've always seen this Mishnah. It's only because Rita opened her mouth up over there, you know, that I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a whole nother layer over here, which is really exciting.
It's possible, from what Martin said, it's also a cultural thing. If at that time that he wrote this Mishnah, the Jews were suffering poverty, as they did quite very often, a Mishnah like this gives them hope and encouragement of how to survive in times of poverty.
It's one of the hardest things I find to learn Torah through the lenses of people that would have learned it thousands of years ago. It's not an easy thing. We are constantly trying to learn Torah through the lens of people living in the 21st century. So, you know, this point about salt, this point about sleeping on the floor, you know, when you look at this as an enlightened modern person, we can look at this and see, like, when I see this, I picture B'nai Barak, I picture Meir Sharim, and I'm like, this isn't for me. This isn't how I like. It's not how I like to learn Torah. I like to, you know, I went to a yeshiva right next to the Western Wall, and it was a beautiful building, and we slept on pretty decent beds, and breakfast in the morning was incredible, you know, different cereals and pancakes one day a week. You know, the particular head of our yeshiva was very in favor of creating an atmosphere which was, one could argue, compared to other academies of Torah learning, was quite physically indulgent. The food was decent, the beds were decent, the showers were decent, but then you don't always see that carried through to every institution. A lot of places have very primitive furnishings, and the dormitories are a dump, and so you can spend time associating this as saying, like, okay, so this is the source for all of this primitive living, because they're abiding by these recommendations, that it's not about what you have, but if Torah is important, and you should live primitively because of it. But actually, it's not like my yeshiva was the first one. The yeshiva in Lublin, Rabbi Meir Shapiro. You've been there?
Yeah.
So the yeshiva in Lublin.
It doesn't exist anymore.
Well, the building's still there. Yeah.
Building is still there. It's a hostel.
It's a hospital or a hospital?
Yeah, they changed. I think we were there just a year before they were going to make it as a hostel. That was 10 years ago. We went to Poland.
So you can still go. You can still go to this building today in Lublin, in Poland. Rabbi Meir Shapiro built it, or opened it, in the 1920s, and it had electricity, and it had indoor plumbing, and it had comfortable dormitories, and it had 3 meals a day, and it had library with tens of thousands of books. It was revolutionary for the 1920s, and seems to fly in the face of how I've always seen this Mishnah. So that was always very much kind of my starting point. I've always struggled with this one, because as much as I love learning Torah, I don't love sleeping on the floor. So this has always been a struggle for me. Yeah, Joy.
I always thought in Judaism the bodily comforts were quite important. And the idea of sleeping on the floor and everything is a very, I don't know how to say, Christian thing, flagellation and deprivation and all that. It doesn't sit well with me.
This is it. We've been on the same page. Morris.
Okay, so feed the good, so feed the nefesh.
Feed the good, yeah. In the way I like it. Rita.
I think I agree a little bit, even contradict myself because
Can you speak a bit louder though, so that people
drink water by measure.
Yeah.
So that means you can't drink as much as you like. That means you were given a certain amount of, I don't know, they call it liters of these days, or whatever they call it. You couldn't even have water. So it might be like David said, it might have been they all lived in poverty in those days.
They very well might have done. Not everything was as accessible as it is now. And this is why, a lot of the commentaries, what they draw out from the surface level of this Mishnah is that that there are sacrifices for when something is important, and we can understand this intuitively. When something is important to you, so you're prepared to make a sacrifice for it, in any discipline in life, people will, first of all, just to get jobs nowadays, people will happily plummet themselves into thousands and thousands of pounds of student debt just to be able to get a degree, right? So we understand that there are things that come at a price, there are things that come at a cost, there are things that require a great deal amount of effort and sacrifice and putting other things aside because you have your priorities. So this isn't an unfamiliar concept to us, but in relation specifically to the study of Torah, what seems to be emerging from here is that to turn around and say, "Oh, I couldn't make time for it, I was too poor," isn't going to stack up. And to conversely turn around and say, "I was too busy, I was too rich to study Torah. I had my whole tycoon, I had my empire to look after," that also doesn't stack up. The Talmud tells us that when when such suggestions would be made, the response that we will get is, well, were you as poor as Hillel? Hillel couldn't, what's the phrase? Couldn't rub two shillings together? I don't know. Isn't there a phrase like that? Couldn't rub two halfpennies together. Yeah. So 2 shekels. So the story goes with Hillel, who was incredibly poor, and he couldn't afford the admission fee into the yeshiva. So he used to climb up onto the roof and listen through the skylight. And one day he did this, and there was a heavy snowfall, and he got buried under the snow. And the students came into the Beit Midrash one morning, and they're like, "Why is it so dark in here?" And they looked up, and they realized that there was a figure of a man who'd been frozen onto the skylights. They brought him down, they warmed him up, they revived him, and they understood that this is what Hillel had been doing all this time. He couldn't afford to be there, and so he had been hiding himself away, so to speak, to be able to listen to the different classes. So that's not going to work for us as an excuse, because if we say, "Oh, I was too poor to learn," we'll say, "Well, you weren't as poor as him. He didn't have anything." I guess we could also have that problem as well. "Oh, well, I couldn't afford to go to yeshiva." We'd be like, "Oh, hello, everything's free on YouTube now. You've got hours, hundreds of hours of Rabbi Nick's shiurim on YouTube. So what's the excuse?" And you can watch them 2 times the speed as well. What's the excuse? Didn't have the time. What do you mean? Just put him on fast speaker mode, and it'll be anyway. So the example that they bring about Rabbi Judah the Prince, he wasn't too rich to study Torah. He had an empire, a whole fleet of ships. He was involved with trade and merchandise and imports and exports, and he was still able to become Rabbi Judah. So one of the emerging themes from this Mishnah is that it takes a lot of effort. There's no denying that. It can take some sacrifice, but these things can't be an excuse for us to avoid being able to delve and being able to become more tuned in to our Torah values and to our Torah study. There is also potentially, one can't ignore the other emerging factor on this, which is that if there is an encouragement for privation and for a primitive lifestyle, then there seems to be a caution here as well that we don't have to be poor, but we also don't have to spend our lives pursuing wealth. And this, I think, is what Howard was bringing to the surface as well. That if we were to say that we've got to chase the money and spend our lives doing that, and that comes at the expense of any self-growth and self-introspection, then that's also not the way to be encouraged.
Yeah, so isn't it the case then that really it's not really about eating bread with salt or sleeping on the floor or whatever, but more an issue about refocusing life?
I think so. That's certainly the way. Until Rita said what she said, that was my
Which I agree with you was amazing.
Yeah, that was my over-abiding focus or theme that I picked up from the Mishnah. There has to be a balance, ultimately. As we say over and over and over again with this, there has to be a balance. It's not about living like a pauper, but it's also not about living like Liberace. Definitely not about living like Liberace. I don't know, it's just what popped into my mind with opulence and the furs and the, yeah.
Just looking back at the text, I just wonder why there's a repetition. It says, "You will be happy and it will be well with you." And that's omitting quotes. And then it says, "You will be happy in this world and it shall be well with you in the world to come." And is that encompassing everything?
So it helps to kind of see this in the Hebrew as well. So the way this is working is you've got the You've got the bread with salt, you've got the water, you've got sleeping on the ground, your life shall be a privation, and in Torah shall you labor. Right? And then the Hebrew says, Imata Osakain, if you do this, then you will find that the words of Tehillim start to come to life for you. What are the words of Tehillim? From chapter 128, verse 2, it says, Ashrecha v'tovlach. It says, happy you shall be, and it shall be good for you. What does that mean? So the Mishnah tells us, Ashrecha, when the verse says, happy shall you be, it means, Ba'olam hazeh, that you will find that there is a degree of happiness that is achievable with a focus on Torah study and a focus on a Torah outlook. V'tov lach, and when the verse was telling us that it's going to be good for you, le'olam haba, it's referring to the world to come. So first you have the quote, and then the Mishnah is explaining the quote as well. A bit like that we do on Seder night, for the bit that we all fall asleep for, where we have the 4 verses, and then it explains the 4 verses, and the band of angels, the seraph, and all not whether this and not whether that, and all the rest of it. So that's the way the Talmud works, the Mishnah works. It will take a source in the Torah, or in Tehillim in this case, and it will explain what the phrase different components mean. So that's what the Mishnah is doing at the end there. It's got 2 components, Ashrecha and Tovlach. Ashrecha, when it says you can be happy, you can even be happy in this world, even if you're living this kind of primitive life. And that's what David was saying, right? The Tovlach, it will be good for you. It will be good for you in the world to come as well. You'll see. That's how we break it down to kind of understand the flow of the text. Back to Rav Meir Shapiro, who started this yeshiva and made it all look very pretty. So he has another way of reading this. Right? We've been reading it as Kachi Darka Shel Torah. This is the derech of Torah. This is the way to. He reads it as Kachi Darka Shel Torah. This is the way of Torah. Eating with salt, sleeping on the floor. Like, no. We should be able to also have a comfortable atmosphere when we're studying as well, which seems to be part of what. Who wrote this Mishnah?
Right, just that one with the bread. Eat bread with salt. It doesn't say, does it?
No, we don't. We've had this throughout the whole chapter. That usually we've said, oh, this one's Rabbi Meir, this one's Rabbi Yochanan. Who was Rabbi Yochanan? It's always your question that you like to ask. No. Who were these people? Oh, now you're asking me the opposite question. Who's written this? So these will have been teachings. This whole chapter will have been teachings that were out there.
Or is that summary? Is that more like a summary?
It's not so much a compilation. I'd go compilation of related statements and related teachings that were out there, which were all connected because they talk about Torah study, and so they all made it into this chapter. Morris.
Yes. Did we cover the part why we have salt with the challah on Shabbat? Is that because from the
second? It's part of the reason. Can't remember if there's other ones as well. I mean, there will be, but.
Does anyone know anyone?
Other than that one, come on.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
Is it the right one?
I think the stronger question would be: is there a reason why, if that is the reason, people think it's only on Shabbos?
Right, because we
that's a good question.
For the new year, don't we?
Right.
Having salt on the new year, so that's because we want a sweet new year. So is it saying that we want a non-sweet the rest of the year?
No, it's not saying that.
I thought that read chapter 6, it was added afterwards. That's why it doesn't say.
Yeah, but that doesn't answer Morris's question.
No, I mean,
You're answering Rita's question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was added on. I'm saying it was a compilation that was added on because they all had to do with Torah study. All these different Mishnayot have to do with Torah study.
You said that book shouldn't have been there, should it?
The 6th chapter was added on. It's a compilation. It's a compendium of different ideas, but they're all connected to Torah study. So there's a couple of just one other analogy that I could have brought in before when we were talking about how we can all understand how some things require sacrifice. So there was a rabbi called Rav Bunim of Peshischa who said, that's a mouthful. So Rav Bunim of Peshischa says, in the same way that a businessman would not think twice if they had to travel, to some far-flung place in the world where things were very primitive, but they had a good deal that they could make. So they'll put up with uncomfortable hotels and poor food, and smells and whatever else you might have to put up with to be able to go and get this deal. But if it means that you've got your cheap product that you can then import back into the country and make thousands and millions with, then it's worth it. It's worth putting yourself through that. So that, he says, is the attitude to Torah study as well. That what you're achieving with that level of connection and with that level of study and the mitzvot that we're doing and the reward that we're receiving for it, okay, so that's worth a couple of rough nights' sleep. In the same way that a business person would happily take that kind of hit to their physical comfort to be able to get a good deal. And there's a famous story as well about Rav Elchanan Wasserman, who actually lived at the turn of the 20th century. I can't remember if he died just before the Holocaust or just after. Let me look that up. But he was, can't remember when he died. One moment. Elchanan Wasserman, born 1874, died 1941. And this is Elchanan Bunim Wasserman, which is who Rabbi Feldman, for those of you who remember Rabbi Feldman, he is in some he is in some way named after Elchanan Bunim Wasserman. So he had a childhood friend who he met up with, who reunited with after many, many years, and his friend saw how poor he was, and he said, "Oh, you're such a clever guy. You could have made so much more money living as a lawyer. Why did you settle for being a rabbi and having this primitive existence?" And he didn't answer him. But then they spent a bit more time together, and then he was taking him back to the train station to send his friend on his way, and he saw that his friend was getting onto an old rickety train. All right. Meanwhile, on the other platform, there was a much nicer train going in the other direction. So he says to his friend, "Why are you getting on this rickety train? Why don't you go and get on the nice-looking train?" And his friend says, "Well, that train's completely useless to me because it's not going in the right direction. I'll end up at the wrong destination if I get on that train. I need to take this rickety train to be able to get to where I'm going." So Rav Elchanan Wasserman goes, All right, now you can understand why I've ended up being a rabbi and not being a lawyer. So a few ideas there. Comments and questions. I've finished early. That's never happened before. Goodness me.
I think it's a bit of a misnomer saying that you live. I mean, you could read that if you live in poverty and you sleep on the floor and you haven't got enough water, it will make you happy. It goes against what Judaism speaks for, which I think is reality. You know, we don't say turn the other cheek. If somebody's really out to get you, you have a right to get them first. I mean, we look at life as it really is, whereas this is a bit looking the other way, depending on how you read it, as you say. I love the way you say, if you speak this, is this the way of Torah? I mean, you can read any of this, any words. It shows you how important it is to understand what people are saying, because you can quote somebody word for word, but you're giving an entirely different interpretation of what they were saying. It's a bit like, when there was a Jewish joke, the chief rabbi of some country was visiting America and they talked about brothels or something, and he said, "Are there any brothels in this city?" And he was doing it out of shock. Whereas he was quoted later on as the headline, "He said, I asked, are there any problems?" It's so important in life not to misquote people,
Right.
and not to use language in the wrong way.
I've never heard that
I
one
don't think
before.
anybody living in poverty and is happy with their situation.
Right. And
We talk about
for
charity. We talk about taking people out of poverty. It's very important to push people. And what I find I know I'm diversing, but we've got a little bit of time. I was involved in charity at some time, and we were told halachically that you give more to the wealthy man who falls upon hard time than you give to the poor man, because of what he's used to in life. Which seemed a bit peculiar to me, but we're realists. Judaism is a realist belief. Hashem doesn't want us to be people who live in poverty, I don't think.
I agree, and that's why I think there's much more than meets the eye to this Mishnah than immediately presents itself on a superficial reading. Because, as I said, this Mishnah is not a halachic statement that this is how you have to lead your life, but there's obviously more at play to what's trying to be conveyed. And I really, really do wonder if Rita has just like unraveled something here, which is.
I must have heard it from her, I think, or one of these things. I must have heard it.
Or maybe your mind is now starting to like pull all the neurons are like starting to connect, and
I've done it a few years now. I think I've learned something.
We're all capable. We're all capable of arriving at novel insights, and that's part of the magic, and that's part of the excitement. That the more you're exposed to, the more the chance is that something will just spark, and you'll say what you're saying. You might not even realize it, but for the Mishnah to say "Kachi darka shel Torah," this is the path of Torah. So the depth to that statement could well be is that you could expect the derech of Torah to look like this, in which case everything that's mentioned here will be an allegory and will be a metaphor for something else. And if you've got the keys to know what each of these things represent, right? You know how in the bigger picture, we'll talk about one idea and we'll see what's the root of that idea, what's the essence of that idea. Okay, so these things we will say, okay, well, what's the essence of bread? What's the essence of pat? Why does it say pat and not lechem? So and what's melach? What's salt all about? What's the essence of salt? Why is salt in the world? Why do we need salt? Right? And then you'll be able to say, so there's something about life that pat and melach represent. And the fact that they are fused together will teach us something about what our path and our life is supposed to look like. And so I just need to find someone who's done the hard work for us to see what's out there. But
why does it say pat and not lechem?
I don't know, Joy. But that's why I say.
Do you know Rabbi Israel Bernath?
How do you spell the surname?
Bernath.
I don't know if I do.
I'm trying to find it. I read it this morning. There's an article that someone had put on through LinkedIn, and it was very interesting about. He put it on, and I can't remember now. But it was basically about a Holocaust. It was an old lady in a supermarket, and.
Is it to do with the Mishnah?
No, it's not.
So give me 1 second. So all those watching on Zoom and YouTube, on Facebook and YouTube, come join us for the after party, and Howard's going to tell us an interesting story. But for now, we'll see you all next week.